how Jung differed from Freud on the unconscious. Episode 16. In the last episode, we discussed how Jung differed from Freud when it came to the structure of the psyche. In this episode, we will discuss how they differed when it came to the unconscious. So, if you're ready to dive into the wonderful world of depth psychology, let's get started. So in the last episode, we looked at the structural differences between Freud and Jung's theories. We saw that both of them had 3 parts to the psyche, but that they differed significantly when it came to what these structures were called and what each one was responsible for. Now, the main difference between these 2 theories comes when we look at the unconscious, because while Freud and Jung both believed in an unconscious, they had very different ideas about what it was. And so to understand their differing views, we need to start by defining our terms. So, to better understand the differences between Freud and Jung's view of the unconscious, we have to break the word apart. Because when we say unconscious, we're really referring to 2 things. Un plus conscious. That is, we are talking about something that is not conscious or not aware. But before we can talk about what it isn't, it would be helpful to first define consciousness. Now, many psychologists today define consciousness as a state of awareness of both the self and the environment. But that definition doesn't really do justice to what Freud and Jung were talking about. You see, according to both Freud and Jung, consciousness was more than just being awake and aware. Rather, it was a particular type of awareness. And to better understand that type, we have to look at another concept, namely that of censorship. You see, both Freud and Jung believed that the mind was much like an iceberg. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with icebergs, let me just say that an iceberg is a frozen mass of fresh water that is composed of a large amount of ice that has been compacted and recrystallized from water in the sea or a lake. Now, the reason why an iceberg is compared to the mind is because, like the mind, most of it is hidden under the surface, and so what we can observe is only a small part of what is actually there. Now, for Jung, this meant that his concept of consciousness was similar to the portion of the iceberg that was above the water. And Jung argued that this part of the psyche, the part that we are conscious of, was heavily censored by the ego. In other words, it was carefully controlled and regulated by the rational part of the personality. This censoring role of the ego leads us to the next part of the iceberg, which is what lies below the water. And here is where Jung and Freud's concepts of the unconscious begin to differ. For Freud, everything below the surface of consciousness was simply repressed. That is, thoughts, feelings, and memories that had been pushed out of consciousness because they were unacceptable. According to him, the unconscious was nothing more than a storage room filled with all the dirty laundry of the psyche. For Jung, however, things were a bit more complicated. Sure, he agreed that there were some things that we pushed out of consciousness because they were too painful or too unacceptable to deal with, and he called this the personal unconscious. However, he didn't believe that this was the only thing that was below the surface. He also believed that there were things below the surface that were neither painful nor unacceptable. They were simply below the threshold of consciousness. And so he called this the collective unconscious. Now, to make things even more complicated, Jung also believed that there were things within the personal unconscious that were once part of the collective unconscious. So now we have 3 layers of the unconscious: the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, and the one that Jung called the collective unconscious. Now, before we continue, if you're enjoying this video and learning something new, then please hit that like button. It will really help my channel and will help me continue making videos just like this one. Thank you so much. And now, let's continue. Let's start by looking at the personal unconscious. According to Jung, this was the part of the unconscious that was unique to each individual and contained complexes and other contents that were a result of personal experiences that the individual had throughout their life. And just like Freud, Jung believed that the personal unconscious was repressed material. That is, material that was once conscious but became unconscious because it was either too painful or too unacceptable to deal with. The difference between Jung and Freud's views is that Jung did not believe that this repression was always done consciously. For example, he believed that traumatic experiences could cause repression to occur unconsciously. And so, instead of just being a repository for unacceptable sexual and aggressive urges, as Freud believed, Jung's personal unconscious could contain any number of thoughts, feelings, and memories that were too painful or too unacceptable to deal with. However, Jung didn't stop there. Unlike Freud, Jung believed that there were some things in the unconscious that were neither painful nor unacceptable. Instead, Jung believed that these things were simply below the threshold of consciousness, and so he called this the collective unconscious. Now, before Jung came along, the idea that there were things in the mind that were below the threshold of consciousness was rather radical. I mean, up until Jung, psychologists and psychiatrists had been trying to bring these things into consciousness as a way of treating psychological problems. But Jung turned that around and argued that there were some things in the mind that simply couldn't be brought into consciousness. And this was a revolutionary idea. So what exactly did Jung mean when he said that there were things in the mind that were below the threshold of consciousness? Well, according to Jung, these were things that were universal. That is, they belonged to everyone. And since everyone shares the same, quote, psychic DNA, this means that everyone has the same unconscious. Now, Jung never spelled this out explicitly, but it seems that what he meant by this was that everyone has the same types of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are stored in the collective unconscious. For example, he believed that everyone had the same fears, hopes, and dreams. And so these things must be present in everyone's unconscious. But why does Jung believe that these things were below the threshold of consciousness? Well, according to him, it's because they are so universal. Since they belong to everyone, they cannot be experienced directly. Instead, they must be interpreted. And that's why Jung was such a proponent of dream analysis and other forms of active imagination. Through these activities, one could access the collective unconscious and interpret the universal symbols that were stored there. Now, as you might imagine, this concept of the collective unconscious was highly influenced by Jung's conversations with certain indigenous people. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this here, but suffice it to say that Jung believed that these people gave him insight into the human psyche that Westerners just didn't have. And so he began to see the collective unconscious as something that was much more than just a repository of repressed material. Instead, he began to see it as a kind of library that contained all of the knowledge and wisdom of humanity. Now, unfortunately, Jung never explicitly defined what he meant by collective unconscious, and so there is a lot of debate among scholars about exactly what it is. Some believe that it is nothing more than a kind of collective memory. That is, it contains all of the experiences of our ancestors, and these experiences are passed down to us through the genes. Others believe that the collective unconscious is more than just a collection of memories. Instead, it contains archetypes, that is, universal patterns of thought and behavior. Still others believe that the collective unconscious is nothing more than a kind of universal database. That is, it contains all of the information that is available to all humans, and this information is accessed through intuition. Now, regardless of what you think the collective unconscious is, what's important to remember is that Jung believed that it was a source of wisdom and knowledge. In fact, he believed that it was the source of all creativity. According to Jung, the collective unconscious was the wellspring of inspiration for artists, scientists, and religious leaders. It was the source of their insights and revelations.
So, in a nutshell, the main difference between Freud and Jung's views of the unconscious is that
Jung believed that there were some things in the mind that were below the threshold of consciousness and that these things were neither painful nor unacceptable. Instead, they were simply universal. And so, Jung's approach to psychology was much more holistic than Freud's. He didn't just focus on the negative aspects of the psyche, but he also looked at the positive aspects as well. Now, whether or not you agree with Jung's view of the unconscious doesn't really matter. What matters is that you understand his view and how it differs from Freud's, because understanding Jung's view of the unconscious is essential to understanding his approach to psychology. Next time, we will discuss how Jung differed from Freud when it came to their views on the self. Until then, thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about Jung, click here to watch this video. Thanks for watching.